My name is Joe Reingold, and I'm interviewing Royal Brin today, and it is October 20th, 2017. Good afternoon. Mr. Brin, tell me a little bit about your family that you know of or that you remember, your grandparents onward.
My maternal grandparents were Sam and Debbie Margulis, and my paternal grandparents were Hyman and Jenny Brin, and my maternal grandparents, I believe, came from Russia, and I, of course, knew both of them. My paternal grandmother died when my father was just a young child, so I never knew her, but I did know my paternal grandfather. At the time I knew him, he was very elderly and partially paralyzed and diabetic and confined to a wheelchair, and lived with us, but had a nurse with him all the time.
What city was this? Where were you?
In Dallas.
Oh, you were here?
Yes.
But where was he from originally?
We found a census report from him in which he said his origin was Russia, Poland. And I presumed from that it was in the kind of border area that passed back and forth in those days. He came to the United States in 1868, and he had a store in Ennis, Texas.
Did he come straight to Texas?
As far as I know. And my father was born in Ennis, Texas. And of course they had moved to Dallas when I was born. I was born at the old red brick St. Paul Hospital on October 9th, 1919.
You just had a birthday.
Yes, October 9th, I celebrated my 98th birthday.
Oh, mazel tov. Amazing.
And my grandfather, Hyman Brin, in his census, the census report we found on him listed his occupation as capitalist, whatever he meant by that. And my father was an investor and had been invested in stocks and bonds, but he had hay fever, so we went to spend summers in Southern California, which is the only place he could get relief from what was then called hay fever, now it'd be allergies, I guess. And he and a friend of his bought small royalty interests in the Getty number 1 well, which was being drilled at Playa del Rey, California, near the southern coast there. And we were out there when the well was coming in and went out to see it when I was just a youngster. And it never did pay off. It produced oil, but it never did produce enough to pay off the original investment. But it was a big help because it got my father interested in getting into oil royalties in Texas, and particularly the East Texas field, so that when the crash came in 1929, he had shifted from stocks and bonds into oil royalties, and it protected us from the worst of the Great Depression.
And you were in Dallas at the time, still living in Dallas?
Yes, Dallas has been my home throughout my life, except the only extended periods away were when I was in the university, and then in my 4 years in the Navy during the war, Second World War.
Mm-hmm. What neighborhood did you live in here?
We lived, in South Dallas, which was where most of the Jewish community was in that time, mainly in 3 streets, Forest Avenue,
Right.
which is now Martin Luther King Jr. Boulevard, South Boulevard, and Park Row. We were on Forest Avenue, and both the grammar school I went to was Colonial Hill Elementary School or Grammar School, and the only other grammar school in South Dallas at the time was a Brown School. At that time, things were looser than they are today, and you could skip grades. And the school year was divided into 2 semesters, and in grammar school, I skipped altogether five semesters. The last one came about because 2 of my best friends went to summer school one year, so that they were up in one grade past what we would ordinarily been in by then. But I wanted to be in the same class they were, and so they allowed me to go, even though I hadn't been to the summer school classes. And I always, and everybody else, always walked to grammar school and also to high school. I went to Forest Avenue High School, which is now Madison High School. And of course, no high school students had cars in those days, nor did their parents take them to school. Everybody walked. And part of the way when I went to grammar school, I walked along railroad tracks and would balance, try walking on the rail, balancing. Each one was about 6 or 8 blocks in opposite directions.
Straight from graduating Forest Avenue High, you said you went to college, right?
Yes.
Where did you go?
I went to the University of Texas. I graduated because of the way I'd gotten out of grammar school in mid-year. I graduated in mid-year from high school, but I stayed on and took a course in typewriting because I didn't want to start at university in the middle of the year. I took a plan that they offered then, in which you'd take 3 years in arts and sciences college, and then 3 years in law school, and at the end of the 6 years you would get both degrees, and that was what I did. And
all at UT. You went there for law. You stayed there for law school as well, right? All 6 years.
yes, and I belonged to Phi Sigma Delta fraternity, which was a Jewish fraternity. Later on, long after I had left, it merged with ZBT fraternity. But while I was going to Texas, there was that Jewish fraternity, and there were two others. There was Sigma Alpha Mu and Tau Delta Phi. The only Jewish sorority when I started was Alpha Epsilon Phi, but sometime during the time I was there, another one, sorority, Jewish sorority, Sigma Delta Tau, started there.
And they're all still there now.
Yeah.
Going strong. So did you go into you said the Navy?
Yes.
Immediately after college, after law school?
On down the way. In law school, I had finished with the highest grade average for the entire 3 years in law school of 94.1, which is, and we later, many years later, my wife and I visited law school again in Austin and talked to the then archivist and librarian there who reported that still remained the highest average ever made in University of Texas Law School.
Wow, that's amazing.
And when the grades had first come out after the first semester in law school, and the grades were published, and I had led the class then, and the Daily Texan newspaper, which came out the next day, had a headline, "No trick to it," because my hobby was magic. And on graduating from law school, I was awarded a fellowship to Harvard Law School for graduate work, so that I was driving across Harvard Square when the word came over the car radio of the attack on Pearl Harbor. So then when I went home for the holidays, a lawyer from Washington came through town. He was getting together a legal team for the Office of Price Administration, which was a new organization just being formed at that time. And I accepted his offer and went back to Harvard just long enough to get my belongings and go off to Washington, where they had quickly put up Quonset huts on the mall for the new organizations, such as the Office of Price Administration. And I was there, and when it became apparent that the war was going to be going on quite a while, I applied for a commission in the Navy. And on the physical exam, I was unable to pass the eye exam, so there was a doctor there who specialized in strengthening vision through some exercises and on some equipment he had. So I went to him for a while and then went back and took the exam again. And I was never able to pass with both eyes at the same time. But I passed with one eye at one time and the other eye another time, and convinced the Navy to put them together. So I was commissioned as an ensign in the U.S. Naval Reserve and immediately went on active duty. I went to indoctrination, at Dartmouth College in Hanover, New Hampshire, which had been taken over the Navy to use to indoctrinate newly commissioned officers. And after that, I went to another naval training school in Boston with more specialized training in seamanship and the use of sonar and radar and experience in learning how to fire the anti-aircraft guns, 50 millimeter and 20 millimeter Arlecans, which were a Swedish manufactured gun, because although those wouldn't be operated by officers in practice, the Navy's theory was that an officer needed to know how to do everything that the crew under him he would have do. And then I was in the Navy on active duty during the war for 4 years altogether, and was on several different ships, and one tour of duty at the Naval Advanced Base on Guadalcanal, and one Jewish connection there. I remember a Seder on Guadalcanal, which was held in a big mess hall, and Jewish personnel from all the different units, Army, Navy, and Air Force, got together there for a Seder held by a Jewish chaplain. And I remember that they even had gefilte fish, which arrived in cans.
That is historic.
And
So was that 1945 already?
well,
April or?
probably sometime in there. And board ship went from island group to island group as the war progressed, and finally ended up back in Lady Gulf.
Mm-hmm.
Was the last, as far as I got aboard ship, and got orders back for 2 weeks leave. So I got back to Dallas for 2 weeks, and then was to report for further orders to the nearest naval district, which was in New Orleans. So I had reported there to wait my further orders, and was there on VJ Day. And I remember that everybody flocked out to, if you've been in New Orleans, you know Canal Street, which is a very wide avenue and with a very wide medium down which streetcars ran. Well, it was completely packed with people celebrating and hugging complete strangers, and no traffic could get by for hours. But I did get orders from there to Great Lakes Naval Station to be assistant discipline officer for the base there. And there, over the weekends, I was able to go into Chicago, and that was the first place where I really came into contact with other magicians as a group. They had a place called the Chicago Round Table at a restaurant where the local magicians and any visiting magicians gathered, and that was the first time I really came in contact with other magicians in a group. And by then I had entered as an ensign, and I'd been promoted during the course of the war to Lieutenant JG, Lieutenant Junior grade, and then Senior Lieutenant. And I was offered a further promotion to Lieutenant Commander if I would agree to stay on to another 6 months. But by then, with the war over, I was anxious to get home and to begin a legal practice. So I turned that down, and then did get offers. I did get back to Texas, in Dallas, and it was shortly after I got back in August '46, and met my wife to be on a blind date in September, and we were engaged by November and married on January the 5th, 1947. So we've now been married for 71 years.
Who fixed you up? Who made the shidduch?
What?
Who fixed you up on the date?
Oh, a cousin of mine's wife was a friend of my wife-to-be, and called her and asked if she would go out with me, since everybody I had known was by then married and gone. And she said she would, so I called her, and we hit it off together pretty quickly. She was from Gonzales, Texas, and had just recently moved to Dallas at the time I met her. And while I was still up at Great Lakes awaiting discharge from the Navy, I got out a legal directory and wrote all the AV firms. That's the highest classification in the legal directory of law firms. There were about 5 firms then that in Dallas that had that qualification. I wrote all of them and told them I'd be back soon looking for a job, and they all replied and said to come by and see them when I got out of the Navy, which I did. And this firm at that time was, the name was Strasburger, Price, Holland, Hilton, and Miller. And it had five partners and 2 associates at the time. And in those days, a new associate had to be interviewed by every partner and approved by every partner before he'd be hired. So I had to make several visits back before I'd met all of them. And I was most impressed by this firm. It's now just called Strasburger and Price, and it was one of in the early days, law firms usually had 5 or 6 names in the firm name, and we were one of the first firms to cut down to just 2 names, because that was the way that the telephone operators would answer the phone anyhow. And so my private legal practice has been with this firm all the way through to retirement. The retirement age was 65, but it was provided that the policy committee could request a partner to stay active if they felt that was for the benefit of the firm, so I stayed on active about another dozen years.
Wonderful.
And also under the partnership contract, a fully retired partner was still entitled to an office and the use of a secretary, so I still come down to the office 2 or 3 times a week and spend 2 or 3 hours here and kind of keep up with what's going on in the legal field.
Keeps you young and your mind sharp.
Yeah.
Yeah. So how has your family grown? You said you had a quick romance with your wife and then got
Yes.
married.
And we have one daughter, who was born in 1952, and she lives with us now. She has never married, and at the time, while I was still in college, we had sold our house on Forest Avenue and rented a 2-story home on South Boulevard for about a year, and then from that, while I was still at college, a bungalow on Park Road for a year or so, and by the time I graduated, we had moved out to and purchased a 2-story home on Lakewood Boulevard, and were there when I got back from the Navy. And when we were first married, we lived there, and my mother lived there too. My father had died by then, and I purchased my mother's interest and my sister's interest in the house, and we stayed into the house till our daughter was born, and then my wife, Carol, didn't want to be running up and down the stairs carrying a baby, so we sold that house and moved up to a house in what's called the Preston Hollow area on Lupton Drive, and that's where we still are today.
It's a beautiful neighborhood.
Besides law, interest is in magic, and I've been started in magic. I had a great uncle who lived in Detroit and worked for Palmolive Colgate Peat Company. When he was an amateur magician, and after he retired, he and his wife spent their winters here in Dallas to get away from the severe winters up in Detroit. And he did magic for me when I was very young, pulling quarters from behind my ears and so on, and promised that he'd show me how when I got old enough. So when I was about 9 years old, he started me off, and that's been my hobby ever since. And after I got back from the Navy, I joined the Dallas Magic Circle, which is a branch of the Society of American Magicians, and I helped form a ring of the International Brotherhood of Magicians here in Dallas. And the magic organizations are unusual in that both the professional and amateur magicians belong to the same organization. I think it's because most professional magicians were originally had it as a hobby, and later went into it as a profession, so that they still enjoy talking magic with others. And eventually in 1969 to 70, I became international president of the International Brotherhood of Magicians, which at that time had about 13,000 members in 54 countries around the world. And as a past international president, I've remained on the board of the International Brotherhood of Magicians ever since. And up to the last 3 or 4 years, I went to the annual conventions. And
That must have been fun.
now travel has become a little too much of a hassle.
Yeah.
But I try to keep up with what's going on anyhow. And I have, in my younger days, performed mostly for civic groups and at the magic conventions, both on stage and in close-up. And have contributed effects to books of magic that are magicians purchased to find new effects.
Besides that fabulous hobby, have you and your wife gotten involved in anything in the Jewish community at large?
Well, in the Jewish community, of course, we belonged, my parents belonged to Temple Emmanuel. And at that time, all of the temples, the Reform Temple and the Sheriff Israel, the Conservative Synagogue, and the Orthodox Synagogue were all in South Dallas. And they've all moved north since then. But I was confirmed at Temple. Dr. David Lefkowitz was the rabbi then and doing all the time I was in Sunday school. And there was no bar mitzvahs then in Reform temples. And we were later, that's where we were married, in the South Dallas Temple, and by Dr. Lefkowitz. And of course we've belonged to the Dallas Jewish Historical Society and the state, the Texas Jewish Historical Society. And my wife has been active in the sisterhood, and she was a member, original member of the volunteer choir at Temple Emmanuel, which will be celebrating its 65th anniversary next year. She was one of the original 4 members that met with Samuel Adler, who had become the music director at the temple, and who wanted to organize a volunteer choir. And it did get off to a good start, and has usually been about 50 members. And she has been active and still sings with the choir. And it has been on trips around the United States and in Europe and in Mexico City and sung for various temples in those places. And as I say, they're planning for the 65th anniversary next year. On the legal side, I was active in the Texas Association of Defense Counsel and was president of it in 1980. And in the American Bar Association, in a particular section called TIPS, which was the Torts and Insurance Practice section. And I was chairman one year of the Products Liability Committee. And
What was did you have a specialty?
well, at first I when I was joined the firm, I did everything that nobody else wanted to do. And I tried cases, but eventually became more or less specialized on the appellate area. And I handled we had, as the firm grew, we reached a height of about 230 attorneys, as the highest, from the 7 that were here when I started. While this is still our main office in Dallas, we now have offices also in San Antonio, Houston office, Beaumont, Austin, Collin County, Mexico City, New York, and Washington, D.C. And eventually, a large part of my practice was not only in handling the appeals from cases tried by other lawyers at our firm, but I also was frequently employed in cases that were tried by other firms. But when it went up on appeal, either when they were appealing or they had won and the other side was appealing. So that in the later years, that was the main thing that I did. And probably the largest case I was ever involved in was the Pennzoil Texaco case, which a jury verdict had come down for $11 billion, which was the largest jury verdict that had ever come down in Texas, or I think in the United States at that time. And both sides already had several lawyers each working on their cases. But when the verdict that size came down, they both sought additional help, and we were actually approached by both sides and ended up on the Pennzoil side. And it was an unusual experience because we had the committee, the briefs were sort of written by committee. Each of the lawyers working on the case had one area to deal with, and then would write it up and circulate it between all the others. And when the oral argument was held, it wasn't held in the courtroom of the Court of Appeals, but in an auditorium of the law school, because there was so much interest around the state.
So many people wanted to come watch.
So a lot of lawyers all over the state came and were in the audience. And the court and the lawyers in the case were up on stage. And of course, it ended up that by the time it reached the end, the judgment had reached $16 billion because of interest which had been accruing.
Yeah.
And
Amazing.
so that was by far the largest case I've ever involved in.
In summary, can you pinpoint one thing that you are the most proud of? Is that possible? You've done so many great things.
Well, I think that I had kind of acquired a reputation as in the appellate field in Texas as doing the last few years of my active practice of being an outstanding appellate specialist for the defense side. The firm originally made its reputation as in the field of litigation, but over the years developed the business side and eventually had separate divisions in all the fields. The appellate field was particularly, I thought, interesting because it cuts across all the substantive fields of law, tax law, personal injury law, estate law, everything else that got into court once it got up on appeal, so that you wouldn't be doing the same thing all the time. They'd be getting all different kinds of cases to work on.
Well, you've certainly had a wonderful, colorful life and career, and it keeps on going. It's not over yet, if I know you. You got another few good years in you there. So thank you so much for interviewing with me, and many, many more good years of health, happiness, and prosperity.
Thank you.